Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour Christmas special. Merry Christmas to you. I hope it's been good. Now, I know not everyone loves Christmas. For some, they simply don't believe in the magic of it all. People feel pressured, or at least heavily urged, to spend all their hard-earned money, to get the best things, to give the best things. It can all be a little bit much for some. And if you've ever lost someone, you know that it can be hard to get as excited for things that once included people who aren't physically a part of it anymore. And the holidays just make it that much harder. Sometimes you don't want to hear all that Christmas cheer. Not to be a Grinch or anything, but tonight, we'll step outside of all the holly and the jolly and step into the seriously spooky Christmas experiences of others. So if you've had just about enough of the Christmas music and peppermint everything, let's get started, shall we? Several years ago, I was at my cousin's house for a Christmas party. She and her husband host one every year for his family on Christmas Eve, and it's basically a tradition that I show up and that I stick around to help clean up, and then we watch Griswold's Christmas Vacation before I make the drive to my parents' house, which was about an hour from where they lived. My cousin's property sat on a greenbelt, basically just woods and wetlands behind their house. It's like a protected area where no one was able to build anything on, but you were able to enjoy it for what it was. I'd only ever explored the area when walking our dogs out there during the day. We would normally walk through the man-made trails until those turned into mush, and we'd have to head back the way we came. The houses around their home were pretty spread out from one another, so where it's possible to see someone, I never had. Not until that Christmas Eve, 6 years ago. We'd finished cleaning, watching the movie, and I knew I had to leave soon if I didn't want to physically fall asleep while driving to my parents'. Before doing so, I knew I also needed to take my dog out. I asked my cousin's husband to go with me, but he was half asleep on the couch, just telling me to stick to the backyard area and I'd be fine. My cousin sort of rolled her eyes at this, and she told me to hang on, that she'd grab their dog and we'd all go out together. Almost immediately after opening the door, my dog ran off into the darkness. I called after him, as did my cousin, but within moments her dog was chasing after mine, headed for the woods. My cousin grabs a flashlight off the back deck, and we take off after the dogs. We reach the green belt, and we notice that our dogs were just standing there, waiting for us. We continued into the woods, and though it was dark, nothing seemed off upon entering. As we were getting closer to the area that turns to mush, my cousin and I stopped, and we were talking about her husband, joking that he would feel really bad if we got murdered out here. We joked like this because there was no reason to be afraid of the area, so it seemed appropriately funny. But then, we noticed our dogs. They both froze at the same time. They were just ahead of us now, but they were stopped dead in their tracks, ears and tails pointed. Sometimes they did this, usually when some sort of critter had caught their attention. But this time was different. Their pointed tails began to soften, and now they stood there with their tail between their legs, whining. My dog was whining, but he was also shaking. Both of the dogs were shaking, but why? My cousin's dog began to let out a low growl, and just before she called out to her, I grabbed my cousin's arm. I'd heard something. We stood there, not saying a word to one another, just staring, with the flashlight dimmed and facing our feet. We were sure that we were hearing what our dogs were hearing. People in the woods. My cousin switched the light off entirely, but we could still see a glow. It was coming from further inside the woods, definitely through the mush. What we were hearing, it seemed like animal squeals, but the predominant sound was voices. They were close, but it didn't seem like they were speaking English, as we couldn't make out what they were saying. As we edged closer to the mush where our dogs were, we each grabbed onto them and stood a moment longer, chanting in unison. Even though what they were chanting was incomprehensible, it made the hairs on all of our bodies stand up straight. And it only got louder. Before we noticed the figures accompanying these voices were getting closer to us, our dogs did. They were now both growling and taking a protective stance. We couldn't see any faces, just shadows, a large group of them, possibly wearing all black, or it was just too dark to see them. But there were these balls that looked like fire, or bright lights that were pulsating like fire. That's when we collectively decided to get the heck out of there. Assuming whoever these people chanting were had already noticed our presence, we didn't bother exiting quietly. So we yanked on our dogs' collars and called, or yelled rather, for them to follow us as we ran. As we rushed into the house, we made a shit ton of noise, and there was my cousin's husband, being awoken from his slumber on the couch by my cousin yelling that we almost got murdered out there. I was standing there just trying to catch my breath. The dogs both stood at the back door, growling out the window. My cousin was explaining what happened out there, and I just looked out the window with the dogs. I turned off the porch light and just watched. You could see a faint glow, even now. Something maybe we'd initially dismissed as lights on a home in the distance. What is the glowing? Torches? I asked out loud, specifically to my cousin's husband. This actually got him off the couch, where he came to see what I was referring to. After a while, he told me that it was probably somebody having a fire in their backyard. At 2 a.m, I argued. He replied saying that he'd seen and heard of weirder things. Instead of trying to convince him that something was seriously off about those lights, I started to pack my goods to hit the road. I'd never been so eager to leave my cousin's house. Just a few minutes into this task, and I hear, "What the f-?" My cousin rushes to the window where her husband is standing to see what he's seeing. I walk into the room and I can see through the window. Now lining a portion of the green belt are 6, 7, 8 torches. Open flames. They appear to be being held by someone because they're not touching the ground. My cousin's husband runs off. I can only assume to grab a gun or something. But my cousin doesn't move. She gestures for me to come closer to look. Do you see any faces? Like, do you think they're wearing masks or something? I honestly didn't know. I couldn't see very well at all, but I wasn't sure it mattered what they were wearing. Isn't this trespassing? I asked it out loud even though I thought I knew the answer, and I suggested that we call the cops. We don't need the cops. These people just need to get the fuck off our property. My cousin's husband made his way to the back door. He had a shotgun in his hand. As he opened the back door, the torches or lights extinguished simultaneously. Now it's nothing but pitch black. I hear my cousin's husband let out a frustrated type of grunt as he makes his way back inside to grab something else. He appears again with several lights in his hands. I have no idea what he's about to do, but I need to get on the road. I'm telling my cousin that I'm going to continue packing as I need to hit the road. She tells me she understands, and just then, I see the entire backyard light up, all the way toward and into the greenbelt. Her husband had 5 different heavy-duty floodlights illuminating the entire area. If anyone was there, we'd spot them. But we saw no one. As I headed to my car, both of them walked me out, and I suggested one last time that they call the cops. Part of me felt bad leaving them, but what was I going to do that the cops wouldn't be able to do? It was a strange Christmas. I rang it in by interrupting something really unsettling in the woods, and then driving alone that night. I kept wishing I'd thought to record it, if for no other reason than to see if I could figure out what they were all saying. Either way, I practically kissed the sidewalk when I got to my parents' house. Something about sleeping in my old bed felt extra safe that night. My cousin and her husband continued to live in this house for a couple of years. Not without issue, though. They kept finding dead animals on their property. Usually a bird, sometimes a rabbit. Always in the same area. Always at the edge of their property, on the greenbelt. Towards the end of them living there, several neighbors had complained about the same activity in the woods. Loud chanting, but no one was sure of the source. People thought they saw fires. But even when the police were called out to the area, they never actually found anyone out there. This made my cousin and my husband uneasy, knowing that it wasn't one of their neighbors or their kids messing around, and that the police were clueless. They decided to put the house up for sale, and it sold quickly. They were surprised, but I was surprised it took them so long to make that choice. That experience ruined our Christmas tradition for a good 2 years because I refused to go back there. It's like what we saw, what I felt out there, it was far from normal. Growing up, it was just me and my mom, and she always made a big deal out of Christmas. Not so much the gifts, but the decorations, the Christmas crafts, the baking, the toy drives, stuff like that. One of my favorite traditions was making special cookies for Santa on Christmas Eve. We would leave them on the mantle of the fireplace with a glass of milk. Then, I would wake up and be delighted that Santa ate most of the cookies, but he'd also left one for me and one for my mom. One year, I was probably 8. A bit too old to believe in Santa, maybe, but the magic was alive and well within me, and I couldn't wait to get up and eat that cookie. But on this Christmas, there was no cookie. There was no plate, even. Had my mom already moved it and eaten her cookie? I looked around the house, and it didn't look like she was awake, but the lights were on in the living room and in the kitchen. I walked back to her bedroom and could see that she was still sleeping. I didn't see any cookies near her either, but I shook her awake anyways, asking her what the heck? She woke up a bit confused and then was excited, telling me Merry Christmas and asking me, where's the cookies? Now I looked confused. I looked back out in the living room. I told her plain and simple. Santa took our cookies, and he took our plate too. He even took the cup. My mom didn't look confused any longer. She looked scared. At the time, I wasn't sure if she was angry or scared, but I knew it wasn't good. She got up rather quickly, went into the living room. Then I saw her checking all the windows, all the doors, to see if they were locked. She did this in all of the rooms, and at the time I really didn't understand why. Eventually, she seemed to calm down and told me that she wasn't sure why Santa would have done that. Otherwise, it was a really normal Christmas. It wasn't until maybe 2 years later when I learned that, spoiler alert, Santa was nothing more than a myth, that it dawned on me. If Santa wasn't real, why did my mom throw away our Christmas cookie stuff? That was like my favorite part. Well, when I asked her, she told me that she didn't throw anything away. In fact, she woke up as she normally did in the middle of the night, ate a few cookies, poured out the milk, and put everything back in its place, and expected it all to be there, just like I did. She told me that to this day, she has no idea what happened that night. She was terrified, but tried to make Christmas normal for me. She even joked about how she thought she was going to have to tell me Santa wasn't real and head to the police station that year. The thing is, nothing was unlocked when she checked. Nothing was broken. At least not that either one of us was aware of. Yet, the tray and its contents were completely missing, without a trace. So, what do you think happened that Christmas? Glitch in the Matrix? Or a good old-fashioned home invasion? My brother has shared this story a few times, more than a few times. He's usually the one to bring it up every Christmas. I was a bit younger than him, as it was in 2003. He was 16 at the time, but I was 11. It always made me feel a bit unsettled, and the rest of my family, too. Whenever he would bring it up, my mom would give him that look, and my grandparents, well, they would tell him to stop talking about the weird stuff. But it was weird, and it should have been talked about. Or at least, I understood why my brother would want to talk about it. So here it is. Christmas Day, 2003. It's myself, my brother, my mom, my dad, and my grandparents. We'd finished dinner, but we were still at the table. The adults playing cribbage at one end, while my brother and I had started a speed tournament at the other end of the table. In my brother's version of the story, nothing weird happens yet. But for me, while in the middle of a game of speed, I just stopped playing. Something was happening to my hearing. I had experienced something like it before, maybe when wearing headphones, but it felt most like when they tested your hearing in school. The moment they put those big headphones on, it almost muted everything around you. I remember in this moment, trying to pop my ears, like I was taught to do on an airplane or climbing elevation when we drive somewhere like our cabin in eastern Washington. Before I could explain what I was experiencing, and before anyone could even tell that something was wrong with me, a bright, very intense blue light filled the entire home. It was hard to tell if it was something that happened quickly or if it took time. I recall it entering from the ceiling and then filling all of the walls down to the floors, and then disappearing entirely. It seemed like it had come from inside the house. The windows, the curtains, they were closed. With the light gone, my brother was now standing, looking around wildly. I still couldn't really hear anything. Some, but not a lot. He looked excited, running over to the window. My parents, they looked worried, and my grandparents looked confused. My brother was opening the curtains, turning back, and saying something to everyone. I finally spoke out, said that I couldn't hear anything, but I could hear the voice in my head. My mom looked at me, grabbed my head, and sort of moved it side to side, as though she was looking for an injury. Being closer to her, I could almost make out sound. I could tell she was saying, "Try to pop your ears." I had tried this. It wasn't working. I just looked at my dad now, who seemed to be asking my brother to come back to the table, gesturing to close the curtains. I looked and it was dark out there. But didn't anyone else see that it seemed to come from above us and not from outside? My brother was walking back to the table when he froze. We all froze. The brightest white light filled the room. It was so bright that my eyes actually felt like maybe they were burning. It looked like I was inside of the sun or a light bulb itself. I couldn't see my family. I couldn't see anything directly in front of me or to the side. And then I could. Everything was back to normal. The lighting. We were all sort of looking around. Being 11 at the time, I don't know how long we all talked about it that night, but we certainly didn't have any answers or resolution by the time we moved on to dessert. My brother especially couldn't let it go. He was sure that my dad or grandpa had some sort of theories. While talking about it, my mom said that she'd seen what I'd seen. A light from the ceiling make its way down. My dad didn't think anything of it, and my grandparents assumed it was coming from outside. Could have been Christmas lights, my grandpa actually said. My brother said that we were all wrong, that it was coming through all of the walls, through the ceiling, through us. He said he saw the light fixate on the area of the garage where my dad keeps his guns. Not the ones that he uses, but the ones that he collects. He told my dad that he didn't believe him. He thought that he'd seen it stop and scan there too. I remember that being the end of it for that year, though. My dad basically shutting my brother down, saying that he had a wild imagination and that it was just a couple of flashes of light. Well, there was a woman my brother ended up doing some contracting work for several years later. She lived in the same area that we grew up. And when I say that my brother didn't let go of this, I mean it. So him being him somehow got to talking to this woman about our Christmas in 2003. Not only did she know what my brother was talking about, but told him that while all she saw were 2 flashes of light, her daughter had come running in from outside, saying that she'd seen a bright blue light, almost like a laser, just scanning the whole property, the whole house. She said it spent a lot of time scanning their house, that it didn't appear to be coming from anything except for the dark sky itself. As soon as it stopped, she ran for the door, and then there was a long, bright, white flash. Basically, I don't discount what my brother says. I also don't discount what anyone else says, because somehow, some way, my whole family all experienced something at the same time, but it was different for all of us. And based on what my brother has discovered through pure persistence, it's not just his imagination that is wild. It's the whole situation. Well, friends, that's the end of our Christmas special. But thank you for joining me, Amanda Jane, for this very special episode of The Darkest Hour. And be sure to tune in for Season 2. The Darkest Hour will be back on the air Friday, January 8th, 2021. So be sure to subscribe to the YouTube, Facebook, The Darkest Hour page, and join me on Reddit. Our subreddit is The Darkest Hour YT, and you can find me under amandajanefmn. Wow, that's a mouthful. But I so appreciate you guys listening and subscribing. It means the world. As always, do you have stories like these? Send them to me. I'd love to share them. amandadarkesthour@gmail.com or on Reddit, amandajanefmn. Stay spooky.